I'm John Rodgers from Cuyahoga Falls, and I've been doing some slide programs down here in Wadsworth, and this is another one called Trails West to the Promised Land. We'll be talking about the Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail, and the Pony Express. In 1822, the Santa Fe Trail felt its first wagons moving from Independence, Missouri, to Santa Fe, New Mexico. This trail was one of commerce, and the wagons were the big Conestogas for hauling freight. Now, I won't use the terms in what is now all present day in this program. Just remember the towns were few and far between and were very small, and that much of the area was designated as territories. The Santa Fe Trail started 20 years before any pioneer trails, and it continued in use until 1880, at least 10 years after the last pioneer had set foot on a trail heading into the American West. The Oregon, or Immigrant Trail, had the same starting point as the Santa Fe Trail, Independence, Missouri. The two markers you just saw are only about 30 feet apart. And here is the courthouse from which they started. Courthouse wasn't there at that time. Travelers to California followed the Oregon Trail to a junction in Idaho. The markers for both of the beginnings of the trails are at the western end of the courthouse. This is the same courthouse where Harry Truman got his political start. And you're looking at Independence in the olden days when the trails were running. The Oregon Trail used the route of the Santa Fe Trail, past this farm, over into Kansas, to a point just west of Gardner, Kansas, out in this country. Then the Santa Fe Trail continued southwestward along the Great Plains. The Oregon Trail turned to the northwest and headed towards Oregon City, a total distance of 2,170 miles for a passage that would require the better part of 6 months. The obstacles were many. Hardship was a fact of life, and death was always looking over your shoulder. You might even see the elephant, a collection of hardships so great that you wanted to give up. Some did and headed back eastward on the same trail that pulled people westward. But more often the push westward had to be continued because everything had been disposed of back home. Now, the first challenge was getting together the wagon, stock, supplies, and equipment needed to make the trip. The hardest part of this phase was leaving family heirlooms behind. Many failed this test, and the sides of the Oregon Trail became the resting place not only for the dead, but for many of these prized possessions. You may assume correctly that many of these were picked up by others who had lighter loads or who were collecting them to sell. This is an actual photograph inside one of the wagons back in those days. And yes, we had photography at that time. One of the printed set of instructions for the Oregon Trail shows that an adult required at least 325 pounds of food for the journey, the heaviest weight being about 150 pounds of flour. Wild game, buffalo, antelope, prairie chickens, and deer was to be part of this menu, but it would not always be available. Water had to be carried at times, since it was not always possible for the trail to be at a river's edge. Some food for animals had to be carried, especially if the starting time was early before the grass was growing. Before I forget, I want to give credit to a lady named Gorsline, whose children's book, The Pioneers, furnished many of the illustrations that I use in here. The wagons used were the smaller ones, sometimes called prairie schooners, not the larger Conestogas. An empty wagon weighed about 1,000 pounds. The box was about 10 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 2 feet high. In the picture you're looking at Scotts Bluff, the little one in the back is the covered wagon. The other is the Conestoga. The stays that held the cloth top extended above the box. The wagon had a carrying capacity of 1,000 to 1,500 pounds. How much was carried depended on the animals pulling the wagon. Oxen could handle the larger weight. Now, an important thing to remember was that wagon parts, even well-seasoned hardwood, often shrunk on the trail, especially on the high plains. I'm showing you the high plains in Wyoming, and the altitude is already over 5,000 feet. And so, each night, you would see scenes like this, where they were trying to keep the metal on the wheel. When departure time came, wagon trains had to be formed. It was very unwise to travel alone. At first, 25 to 30 wagons made up a train. But as the movement quickened, 200 wagons in a train was not an uncommon sight. And a leader, a wagon train boss, was needed. Someone who had traveled the trail before. With some exceptions, the word of the wagon train boss was always obeyed. The train also contained livestock, horses, cattle, milk cows, and spare draft animals to fill in to pull the wagon. One of the early large trains was led by Jesse Applegate in 1843. It contained 1,000 persons, 120 wagons, and 5,000 cattle. Departure time was a worthy topic of conversation because much depended on it. This is a picture of Independence with a wagon train heading out of it going west. If the train left Independence in March, they might find themselves in a blizzard in Kansas or Nebraska. But that train should, even with a slow pace, get to Oregon long before the early snows of autumn. Such an early departure meant that much feed for the livestock must be purchased and carried because several weeks would pass before the grass began to grow. This is Mount Hood in Oregon, and you'll see it later on as they reach their destination. April brought rain and lots of mud, but the grass was starting to grow and not too much feed had to be carried for the animals. This is virgin prairie that you're looking at. And in this one, I want you to look at the lady here who has a fire going in midday, and she is cooking the lunch meal and the dinner meal at that time. If the party waited until May, conditions were much better, and the grass was already growing vigorously and would provide most of the food for the livestock. But now the required miles per day had to be made because early autumn snows might greet the wagon trains in Oregon long before Fort Vancouver or Oregon City were reached. But finally the wagons rolled out, and after a few days the Oregon Trail stretched out to the northwest across the Great Plains. Depending on the departure date, the wagons had to roll an average of 12 to 16 miles each day. That meant that any layover days for sickness, death, or wagon or stock trouble meant catching up the miles. After 5 or 6 days on the trail, the first river crossing was reached, the Kansas River in the area by Topeka. And here's what a river crossing looked like, a real treacherous sight and experience. About 10 to 12 days out, the Big Blue River had to be crossed in northern Kansas in the area of this town, Marysville. In between those two rivers, smaller streams had to be forded, but streams and rivers meant that water was available. Now, we'll talk more about Marysville later because the Pony Express had an important stop there. Our next stop, Hollenberg, is also rich in Pony Express history, but the Oregon Trail passed through there long before the Pony Express. Then the route of the Oregon Trail went into Nebraska and followed the Little Blue River. Once more, the trail went through a spot which later would become a Pony Express station, Rock Creek Station. That's the only building left at Rock Creek of the originals. And here is another photograph that's amazing. That's the Overland stage going through Rock Creek. Now let's pause on the trail and talk about a day of travel. 4 o'clock, camp awakens. 5 o'clock, draft animals were being readied. 7 o'clock, breakfast of sow belly, that's bacon, and slam johns, those are flapjacks, finished. Personal preparation done, wagons rolling. 11 a.m., nooning, prepare lunch and supper, wash dishes and clothes, more or less for the draft animals than for the people. And then at 2 o'clock, you're underway again. That's 2 p.m. 6 to 9 p.m., stop for the night. Time depended on availability of good sites. The circling of the wagons, which you see in this picture, was done more for control of stock than for defense against Indians, sort of a community atmosphere. Fires were often made of buffalo chips, especially on the high plains, because much of the country had no trees and often not even brush. Now in this picture, this lady is not a pioneer. She has already settled out on the plains, but she has gone out on the plains and gathered buffalo chips for fuel. The ride was rather rough. It was said that the ride in one of the prairie schooners afforded more exercise than walking. Many of the pioneers, especially those who stayed well, walked the entire 2,170 miles to Trail's End in Oregon. The trail continued over the rolling Great Plains, the sea of grass. This was tall grass prairie, 12 feet high, and often it was hard to see over the grass, especially for the children. Later, this would give way to the higher and drier plains. The pioneers must have seen numerous prairie dogs like this little fellow. And there were graves, and without such markers as these. But this one was known, and the memory of it has been preserved. It's by Fort Kearny in Nebraska. Reaching Fort Kearny meant that the wagon train had reached the Platte River, the river that would be followed the rest of the way across Nebraska and into Wyoming. And here's a Nebraska spectacular that the pioneers on the trail never saw. The sandhill crane migration takes place along the Platte River long before wagon trains reach it each year. Those are all a 4-foot bird with a 6-foot wingspan in the air. And here's what they look like at sunset. And on the north side of the Platte River, the Mormon Trail carried its stream of pioneers. But in 1841, when the first Oregon Trail travelers on the south side of the river reached Fort Kearny, they were 5 years ahead of the first Mormons on the north side. But now we'll go back east and pick up the Mormon Trail. From Nauvoo the Beautiful on the banks of the Mississippi River in Illinois, the stream of pioneers flowed westward. And this is Brigham Young's house. And incidentally, Nauvoo the Beautiful was larger than Chicago at that time. These were the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, the people who are called the Mormons. And the first thing they had to do is cross that river, the mighty Mississippi. And here's a plaque on the Illinois side marking the beginning of the Mormon Trail. Nauvoo was being destroyed by the Gentiles when the first Mormon pioneers blazed a trail across Iowa. But they also planted grain, built small bridges, graded stream banks at fords, and in general made the trip easier for those who would follow. I'm going to show you this map twice. Now, to show you this part, here's Nauvoo, and they came over here, and this is the Mormon Trail. You see a few breaks in it. I'll show you a picture of Mount Pisgah, and it went over, and this is Missouri River. And then I'll come back later on to show you the other part. Sugar Creek, the first base in Iowa, was only a few miles west of the Mississippi, and many people started their suffering there. But Nauvoo was under such pressure that many felt that they could no longer stay. It was midwinter, and the temperature was often below zero, but it was a month or more before the push west began. Some crossed the Mississippi River on ice, but most were floated across on flatboats. The year was 1846, and the push across Iowa would take at least 4 months. The trail went across southern Iowa, passing in the area of Farmington, Bonaparte, Keosauqua, Bloomfield, and Garden Grove. By this time, they had moved into tall grass prairie. After a rest at Garden Grove, the next major stop was Mount Pisgah. This was a very special Mormon place. The final push to the Missouri River was across the prairies about 12 to 35 miles south of I-80. The goal in this stage was the Missouri River. this one. And Canesville, now Council Bluff, was established on the Iowa side. Winter Camp was established across the Missouri River just north of Omaha, Nebraska. Here they're ferrying the wagons across the Missouri River. Now from this camp, the first big surge to the Salt Lake Valley began. The first group, called the Pioneers, had 72 wagons and 93 horses, and they had a considerable mission: make the trail to the Salt Lake Valley passable for all those who would follow. That trail was 1,032 miles, including the part that combined with the Oregon Trail. Then the big company hit the trail, all 2,000 of them, with 566 wagons, 3,000 draft animals, and 5,000 other miscellaneous animals. On the western side of the winter camp, a cemetery holds a number of the saints who never made it to Utah. Towns were built and farms were developed. Mormons were in the Missouri Valley for at least 7 years. There was even a Mormon battalion sent to fight in the Mexican War. The winter camp was abandoned in 1848, as agreed upon with the local Indians. And then the trail left winter camp north of Omaha, went west to Fremont, and then followed the Platte River on its north banks. You're never too far from the Mormon Trail if you stay on the Lincoln Highway. That's U.S. Route 30, from Fremont westward to North Platte, about 250 miles or 16 to 20 days. My wife and I covered that in about 5 hours. You can see the site of an old cottonwood tree. The original tree has died but has been replanted, and there's a monument. Markers show a number of points where the Lincoln Highway crosses the trail. But we have passed Fort Kearny, and that's where we left the Oregon Trail. Fort Kearny, built in 1848, was not a major fort and wasn't even there when the trail was first used. And you had come only 325 miles from Independence, the starting point. You can see from the picture there's not much left of old Fort Kearny. That's it today. Now the Oregon Trail followed the south bank of the Platte River, and somewhere west of North Platte, the South Fork had to be forded. The North Platte would be the dividing line between the Mormons and the Gentiles. The hills leading into Ash Hollow were a challenge, and it's said that some used ropes to ease the wagons down, and the name Windless Hill has stuck. The reward was Ash Hollow. This is the Oregon Trail still going through Windless Hill, and then Ash Hollow, the cliffs of Ash Hollow are there, and down in the springs, the best water on the Oregon Trail. That's from the journals. This formation was the next large landmark, Courthouse and Jailhouse Rocks. Now the trail goes northwest, and days before it was reached, Chimney Rock was in view. Chimney Rock in this painting, that's this rock over in here. It was the most mentioned landmark on the Oregon Trail, mentioned in more journals than any other one, far and away. Most journals that have been saved mention it. The travelers were still in Nebraska, but the western part of it. Just to give you a little idea of scale, this is my wife down here, and there's the rock. Approaching Scotts Bluff, let's go over the river to the Mormon Trail on the north bank. This is the grave of Rebecca Winters. That hoop is original, and it was because of that marking that the railroad track laying crew knew of the grave and laid the tracks just far enough away to miss the grave and leave the final resting place of this Mormon lady undisturbed. She had died of cholera. At Scotts Bluff, you can see and walk on the original trails. Views from the top, which is 800 feet high, gives you an idea of the immensity of the high plains. And in this area, this area right in here I'm talking about, try to picture the covered wagons circled for the night. And where you walk on the trail, At least 250,000 pioneers and gold seekers passed. You can still walk on it today. You've seen a picture of this little old covered wagon before. Now the next stop was Fort Laramie, and we would be over in Wyoming at that point. It's 150 miles from the city of Laramie, so don't look for the two to be together. Here supplies could usually be bought, and 1/3 of the miles to Oregon had been traveled. Old Bedlam is the oldest Army structure in Wyoming. That's the one in the background. It was built in 1849, and it served as post headquarters during the continuing use of the trails until 1868. Fort Williams, a wooden palisaded fort, occupied this site until the building of an adobe structure named Fort John. Don't know why, because it was always called Fort Laramie. The Army took over in 1849 as a surge of gold seekers hit the trail. Some had been on the trail in 1848. Now in this case there's a little river running here, but that area back over in there was the wagon circling area to spend the night. Mormons, Oregon and California pioneers, gold seekers, Pony Express, and Overland Stage made stops at Fort Laramie. 45 to 60 days out of a year, this fort was a very, very busy place. And here's one of the stages running through. Now let's use this spot where the Oregon and Mormon trails join to list some of the hardships of the trail. Number 1, fierceness of prairie storms, lightning and wind, large hail, and St. Elmo's fire. And number 2 is really the big one, cholera, an intestinal infection caused by a bacteria promoted by poor personal hygiene. It may last a few hours or a few days before death, but always death. Quick and complete dehydration. In the gold rush years, that's 1849 to 52, those were the worst. 2,000 deaths in each of these years caused by cholera. Number 3, drowning, especially bad at river crossings. Many of these people were non-swimmers. Number 4, gunshot wounds. Many had never had a gun, but now some of them felt they had to have them out on the trail. Number 5, rattlesnakes. Most actually left the trail, but some people got bitten by them, and this is a Kansas prairie rattler that you see in amongst the grass there. Number 6, steep slopes in any condition, such as soft, clinging soil that handicap the draft animals. Some danger from animals eating loco weed. No food or contaminated water. Many dry, alkaline plains like this. Number 8, no food, no wild game available where expected. No wood or buffalo chips. And number 10, Indian attack. Actually very rare, and the worst of the Indian attacks were all the way over in Idaho. Number 11, a buffalo herd going across the trail. They're not grouped together like that, but can you imagine sitting in a wagon train for about 5 hours while 150,000 buffalo cross in front of you? Number 12, early snow in the mountains, especially the Blue Mountains of Oregon. And number 13, lots of dust. Burials were often unmarked, especially in certain Indian areas, and quite often were right in the trail to prevent wolves from getting at the body. Out in this picture, there are a number of unmarked graves, so I am told. Now let's follow the pioneers, Mormon and Gentile, on the single trail across Wyoming. Not far west of Fort Laramie, in the area by Guernsey, you can still see 2 features of the trail. Register Cliff, where many left their names. And then here's an Oregon Trail marker here. We're still at Register Cliffs. I've held up the other one. And that is a marked grave. This is a grave here, but there are several unmarked graves back in here. And the other feature is the ruts in the limestone where the wheels and axles of thousands of wagons scraped and cut the rock. Again, you can walk in the same track of the pioneers. Can you imagine going through there with your oxen pulling your wagon? You hope you had oxen pulling your wagon and you walking along behind. Still there today, you can walk on it. The trail goes northwest and then west to Casper. After heading southwest, the trail then leaves the North Platte River and follows a tributary, the Sweetwater. Many of the journals mention the Black Hills, the mountains which we now call the Laramie Range. There was a Mormon ferry very close to the junction of the two rivers. The Mormons were still improving the trail, and in some cases, like a ferry, they charged for the service. The first landmark in the Sweetwater country is Independence Rock. This is another place where pioneers left their names. The peeling of the rock and the growth of lichens has ruined many, but on one side, the one you're looking at, many names can still be viewed. And this is the Sweetwater flowing out from by Independence Rock. I'm out to the west of the rock at this point. And then in this painting, the children are looking down on the wagon train, and this is the Sweetwater going west. Devil's Gate can be seen from Independence Rock, but from this point you have a much better view. This area contains a number of unmarked graves, and you've seen that picture before because when I was talking about burials. And through this area, the wagon trains came, all behind us. And here's Split Rock. That's another landmark, but it was probably noted and passed unless the day's journey was drawing to a close. This is the mountain right over in here, and this is the Sweetwater running. Much of this area where the trail was passing is over 5,000 feet above sea level, and sometimes it reached 7,000 feet, and these figures are not the peaks. If you look to the north, some ways along there, you would see the Wind River Mountains, and they were much higher, and you were glad that you weren't trying to get a wagon train through them. South Pass on the Continental Divide does not require a very steep ascent, but it is 7,550 feet. If you were heading to Trails End in Oregon, you were finally at the halfway mark out in this country. South Pass City, several miles north of the pass, was not settled until 1867 when gold was discovered. Well, we're still out on the plains there, and it reads, the Oregon Trail in memory of those who pass this way to win and hold the West. You will see those words used in several markers out in the American West. And this is South Pass City. I put it in because it's one of the nicest ghost towns that we have seen. Later in the life of these trails, as you approach South Pass, if you had ample provisions, you could take the Lander Road and head more directly to Fort Hall in Idaho. The Lander Road cut out the entire dip down in western Wyoming. This dip down here, you would be up in here. The Lander Road cut out the entire dip down western Wyoming to Fort Bridger, and then the required northwest push to Fort Hall. And why were these people heading to these new promised lands? Number one, free and fertile land. Number two, fleeing high taxes. Number three, escaping increasing disease of cities. Number four, to shed the European heritage and establish a new identity. And number five, manifest destiny. This conquering of the Western lands was ordained. They really believed this. Many regarded themselves as God's chosen people, and thus they could not fail. This was true not only for the Mormons, but many who were headed for Oregon and Washington. But during the pioneer years, 34,000 immigrants died and were buried along the Oregon Trail. That's about 16 per mile. From 1840 to 1860, over 250,000 people had gone over what Indians called the Big Medicine Path, the Oregon Trail. Some unmarked graves right in that small picture that you're looking at. 362 had been killed by Indians, while 425 Indians had been killed by, and I put it in quotes, whites. Except for local deviations, such as Scotts Bluff, the trails up to the South Pass area were much as described for much of their use. But two deviations are worth mentioning. After 1848, other places such as St. Joseph, Missouri, were also starting points for the Oregon Trail. In 1856, Mormon immigrants began arriving in larger numbers from Europe, especially the British Isles and Scandinavia. They were helped financially by the Mormon Church, and they were able to get as far west as Iowa City, Iowa, using ships and trains. There, a unique pioneering method began, the use of hand carts. The church simply was not able to provide covered wagons and oxen for all of these immigrants. They devised the hand cart, and hundreds were built. You couldn't carry much, and you provided the power, so the cost was about as low as possible. And there are about 1,300 miles from Iowa City to Salt Lake City. About 3,000 people used hand carts. Here's the map that I told you we were coming back to. Now the hand carts, the red line is I-80. The hand carts went from Iowa City along here. Route 6 is what it is. They passed just north of Fort Des Moines at that time and reached out in here to Lewis and joined the Mormon Trail out at Lewis. The handcart route went west from Iowa City along Route 6, just north of I-80, over to Newton and Fort Des Moines. You're looking at the state capitol that doesn't look like a fort anymore. Then it angled down and joined the Mormon Trail at Lewis in Cass County, 15 to 20 miles south of I-80 in western Iowa. This is one of those paintings from that children's book. And if you have noticed, you would see one side and then the other of several of them. And then if you went to Lewis, Iowa, this is what you would see. It doesn't actually say that the trails met there, but they did. Now moving back to western Wyoming, initially the trail went to Fort Bridger in the southwest corner of Wyoming. And we're talking about this area over here. Fort Bridger began as a trading post in 1842. The Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail, the Overland Stage, and the Pony Express used it. The Mormon Trail continued that way. But the Oregon Trail, before getting to Fort Bridger, was provided with another one of those double-edged opportunities. At the parting of the ways, 6 miles beyond South Pass, the sublet, or Greenwoods cutoff, came into use. It cut about 50 miles off the trip, but it also provided no water for about 50 miles. And that's a picture of it from the air. And you were to choose. If you were one of the Mormons, you went to the left. If you were on the Oregon Trail, you could choose that way. But before you lightly dismiss this and think it's no decision, think of the people, the draft animals, and the other stock in the wagon train, and the need for all of these for water for about 3 days. The Mormon Trail continued from Fort Bridger to the Salt Lake Valley, and in that relatively short distance encountered some of the worst portions of the trail. And we're talking about this little drop down here. Fort Bridger is right there, and Salt Lake City is right there. No pioneers had gone before, and the trail had to be cut from scratch. Some of the grades bordered on the impossible for wagons. But finally, on July 24th, 1847, this is the right place. Those were the words of Brigham Young. A large number of Mormons used the trail in 1846 and 47, but the trail continued in use for another 22 years. Between 1846 and 1853, 30,000 saints passed through the Missouri Valley and continued west on the Mormon Trail in covered wagons. Between 1847 and 1868, 50,000 Mormon immigrants from the British Isles, Scandinavia, and Germany had traveled the trails. One, in quotes, poor company, an English group, had arrived in the Salt Lake Valley all the way back in 1850. The handcart was first used in 1856 with 3,000 people, 653 carts, and 40 supply wagons using the trail. The Mormons were usually well organized, and large groups were split into companies. Two of these companies of handcarts in 1856, the first year of their use, were involved in the greatest disaster of all immigrants on all western trails. The word was given at Florence, Nebraska, where the winter camp had been, on September the 3rd, 1856, to begin the journey to the Salt Lake Valley, a distance of over 1,000 miles. The Willie Company, 500 people, and the Martin Company, 576 people, started the trip. The trail across Wyoming, with its 1 mile or more altitudes and a late starting time, doomed both companies. In the Sweetwater area where we are now, disaster descended in the form of snow and extreme cold. Fingers, toes, feet, and legs were lost, in addition to a death toll of over 200 for the two companies, and it was right close by this point on the Sweetwater. Rescue came from the Salt Lake Valley, but for many it was too late. See, on my map, all of this dark stuff is high country, and you go into that late at your own peril. You might be in snow, and this is what they think the view would have been with those people with their hand carts. A real disaster. Now, by comparison, the Donner Party in the winter of 1846 and 47 was stranded in the Sierra Nevada of California after trying a shortcut. The death toll was almost half, but the party was only 87. Tragedy came in the snow and cold of Donner Pass, and we're talking about right in here, going across the Sierra Nevada. The Oregon Trail pushed to the northwest into Idaho, offered a brief stop at Soda Springs, and you were actually looking at the springs and the bubbles still coming from it. And then it pushed on past this Sheep Rock area and pushed on to Fort Hall, the 2/3 point of the trail. And then I have a couple of pictures to show you of Fort Hall as reconstructed. But a short distance past Soda Springs, a cutoff, the Hudspeth, came into being to cut off some miles on the way to California. But many provisions had to be in your wagons because the passage across Nevada would test to the limit. By taking the Hudspeth cutoff, the provisioning offered by Fort Hall was also being forfeited. This is the Snake River that they have finally reached, and they're going along the sides of it. Now, between this pass through here, that's called Massacre Rock, and in 1862, now that's after the trail was really almost out of use, an attack on pioneers by Indians occurred at this point, with 10 being killed, and thus the name of the site is Massacre Rock. Now, winding along the Snake River, the next junction of extreme importance was near a crossing of this little river, the Raft. This was the original junction of the California Trail, and these kind of people went over that trail. Now, most of the pioneers who had traveled the trail system ended up in California and Utah. Those poor people that went into California had to go across stuff like that you see in the northern part of Death Valley. But most went into California and Utah, and you wonder sometimes when you hear these figures why we call it the Oregon Trail. During the immigration years of 1840 to 59, about 52,000 people went to Oregon, 70,000 went to Utah, and about 162,000 went to California. That's a total of about 284,000, with the peak year being 1850 with 50,000. That's one of the gold rush years. And those numbers indicate the importance of that Raft River junction. Now remember also the gold seekers on the trail would certainly have dropped off the Oregon Trail at that junction if they had not taken that cutoff before. Now heading on towards Oregon, the trail continued to follow the south side of the Snake River. This is Shoshone Falls of the Snake, a beautiful area. And then they had other waterfalls. Now they really welcomed these because they could get pure water from these as they went along. And then the valley and the river coming through it would look like that. Very dry, but some vegetation. And they're still making their way towards Oregon. They're in Idaho at this point. And they were going on up to this, the Three River Crossing. So they followed the south side of the Snake River until the Three River Crossing. The original trail made the crossing, moved away from the river on the north side of it, and then it went on to Fort Boise. Now here's what those islands look like in the river. They had crossed from that side, hitting this island, hitting one other island, and then coming over to where I am standing. And then I've turned and they would follow this track or trail on up. Incidentally, for you, people who haven't been out there, this bush that you see, that is sagebrush. And there are the three islands back in there. And then you would keep on going through there. This is in a little ways away. In later times, a route was made which continued on the south side of the Snake River, very dry, but it meant that the three-island crossing, which was treacherous, did not have to be made. The converging point for these two routes was another Fort Boise, a Hudson Bay trading post where the Boise River empties into the Snake. You can't see it from here, but looking up that way about 1.5 miles is where old Fort Boise was, on the Idaho-Oregon border. But even though the pioneers were now in Oregon, many more miles of very rough trail had to be covered. Only then would trails end and the Willamette Valley be reached. Only a short distance into Oregon from that last picture, a last farewell was given to the Snake River. Farewell Bend. It would continue its course through Hell's Canyon, and the pioneers would meet its flow again only after it had emptied into the Columbia River down through there. If in our day you follow Interstate 84 from Farewell Bend up to the Columbia River and then westward on the south bank to the Dalles, you would never be far from the Oregon Trail. Indeed, you could cross and recross it, but that is today. Now these scenes are in a magnificent center outside of Baker, Oregon, at a place on the trail called Flagstaff Hill. And before I leave this picture, those mountains in the background are the next thing they have to cross. Those are the mighty Blue Mountains. This is an interpretive center, and you're looking at 4 scenes within it. And these are all have tape for it, and you can hear what the pioneers are saying. And this one especially, a mother who has lost one of her children, is especially touching. And it's up on a hill where you can see the Oregon Trail. And then moving on up into those Blue Mountains. When the trail crossed the Blue Mountains, pioneers who must have thought that they had suffered every hardship experienced some of the toughest part of the entire trail. In the early days of the trail, after crossing the Blue Mountains, that is the exact Oregon Trail going through. And that's a drawing of crossing the Blue, as they called it. Now, in the early days of the trail after crossing the Blue Mountains, they might have spent a 2-day journey off the trail to go to the Whitman Mission at Walla Walla, Washington. This would be done for provisions, medical help, or other needs before the final push. The trail continued westward to the Dalles and the Columbia River, and that's what you're seeing now. But then there was only room for the river. If it was before 1846, your wagon and all provisions, cattle, everything had to be rafted down the Columbia River. And that was one of the sights they saw, mighty Mount Hood. And you had to either build your own raft or pay for the services. And it was dangerous at best. All of these views of the river are only part of what had to be traveled. And then you would put ashore at Fort Vancouver, the trail's end. And that's old Fort Vancouver as it looked then. Here's one of the guard towers today. And here's just a general view of what they have of the fort. Each of these pads was a building at that time. And here is mighty Mount Hood. In 1846, a land bypass was opened, the Barlow Road. It dropped south to the east of Mount Hood and then cut south of the mountain across Barlow Pass in the Cascade Mountains. This road became the best way for the last miles, but it had a difficult part, Laurel Hill, and a grade so steep that it was called the chute. And here is that chute. Can you imagine bringing a wagon down through something like that? They later were able to eliminate it and go around. Now, using the Barlow Road, Trails End became Oregon City, and we were already to the west of the big mountain now, and here is what Oregon City looked like at that time. So you had reached Oregon City, and the great and beautiful Willamette Valley stretched out, the promised land. Here's a little bit of Oregon City today, and a couple of views of the river. That's the Willamette River. And then further on down, this is those paintings again. They were just happy to be there. They were started in working the next day. And from the air, here's what the Willamette Valley looks like today. And from the ground further on down in it, this is where one of them may have settled. Octavius Howe, an Oregon Trail traveler, had this to say of the experience. Those who crossed the plains never forgot the ungratified thirst, the intense heat and bitter cold, the craving hunger and utter physical exhaustion of the trail, and rude crosses which marked the last resting place of loved companions. But there was another side. Neither would they ever forget the level prairie covered with lush grass, the glorious sunrise in the mountains, the campfire of buffalo chips at night, the last pipe before bedtime, and the pure, sweet air of the desert. True, they had suffered, but the satisfaction of deeds accomplished and difficulties overcome more than compensated and made the overland passage a thing never to be forgotten. And they saw mighty stars at night, and hopefully occasionally a sunset like that. The Oregon Trail was in use until 1860. The Mormon Trail was in use until 1869, the year of this historic moment. At Promontory Summit in Utah, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroads met, and the nation was spanned by a railroad. Today, you can see the recreated engines lined up face to face with only a few ties between them, including one in the same place as the one that received the Golden Spike. Now we have to go south to Ponca City, Oklahoma, to see the finest monument dedicated to the pioneer woman. And it certainly belongs in this presentation. It is the third largest bronze statue in the world, all 17 feet of it. And in spite of its location, the Oregon and Mormon trails always spring into your thoughts when you see it. The courage of the pioneer woman is something that should be remembered. This 4x10 painting by Irving Bacon is called Conquest of the Prairies. It is in the Charlie Russell Gallery in Great Falls, Montana. Now, for just a moment, put yourself in the place of the Indians, seeing all that is happening to change and take away your land and your buffalo. Now, you won't see it quite as vividly as the ghost wagon in the picture, but as you go across central Wyoming, imagine the wagon trains of bygone days and give silent thanks that they did make the journey. May these words, pictures, and remembrances burn into our minds and memories, that we might never forget these pioneers and the tremendous contribution they made to these United States. Now, while activity on the pioneer trails was slowing down and ending, another phenomenon sprang up in the West, the Pony Express. Before the last of 650,000 miles was ridden on horseback, the Pony Express had made itself an indelible part of American history. And that's the route of the Pony Express. It didn't follow the Oregon Trail beyond Fort Bridger, and then it cut down across Utah and across the desert of Nevada. Senator W.M. Given of California had pushed for some kind of mail service, faster mail service, between California and the East. But with the approaching Civil War, nothing was provided by Congress. He turned to Mr. Russell of the overland transportation firm of Russell, Majors, and Waddell, and that firm started the Pony Express. They employed about 100 riders whose weight was supposed to be no greater than 135 pounds. They even advertised that orphans were preferred. There was real danger in these jobs. The pay was $120 to $125 per month. The rider normally carried 1 or 2 revolvers and a knife. I have in parentheses that you'll see many riders depicted with a rifle, but that was not the case. Pony Express riders did not have the wherewithal to carry a rifle. 80 riders were needed for the run both ways. The service started with 1 run each per week, but was increased to 2 per week. 400 good, strong horses were purchased and were well fed and carefully handled. Top condition of all horses was a very high priority. The first run started on April 3rd, 1860, westward from St. Joseph, Missouri, right at this spot, and eastward from Sacramento, California. This is the Pony Express bond right across from that marker. The distance was 1,966 miles, and these first runs took about 11 and a half days. Later, the time would be shortened to 8 days. The first part of the westward run meant being ferried across the Missouri River on a flatboat. But then it was across open country with relay stations. They provided fresh horses set at 10 to 15-mile intervals. This first rider took the mail all the way to a home station at Marysville, Kansas. And frankly, that's about 123 miles, a little longer than they were supposed to ride. Our home station had horses and riders, while a relay station normally had only horses. This home station at Marysville is the only one left on its original site. And remember that Marysville already had felt the wagons of the Oregon Trail. Home stations were usually 40 to 50 miles apart. I might revise that. I might say about 70 miles apart. But the Marysville home station is about 123 miles from St. Joseph, Missouri. The next stop was a relay station, the Hollenberg or Cottonwood station. It is the only original relay station still on site. It was an old ranch house. At this station, the mail had now come 123 miles from St. Joseph. The Hollenberg station is an old ranch house, and this was also a stop for the Overland stage, which operated from 1853 to 1869. I think I better go back and change the distance from St. Joseph to Marysville back to my 100 miles. Now the route moved into Nebraska and the Rock Creek station. One last view of the Hollenberg station. And the Pony Express rider is on his way, and here is that same one I showed you before of the stagecoach coming into Rock Creek station. And you can still see remnants of the Oregon Trail. This was the reconstruction of an old barn there. This was a relay station for another change of horses. Now the rider would blow a small bugle as he came into a station. He would dismount as soon as he arrived, pull the moquila, that's what you're looking at, with its 4 locked mail pouches off the saddle, put it on the saddle of the fresh horse, and be on his way again in about 2 minutes. The moquila could not be removed while the rider was in the saddle. This is what one of the changes would look like. He's already made the change. I hope you notice those pouches. That's where the mail went. And in those pouches were thin paper letters. I mean, they didn't weigh much, but a total limit of 20 pounds. $5 was the beginning price for a letter, but the price was later reduced. The Pony Express route followed the Oregon Trail. It had reached it at Marysville. It used it into western Nebraska until the Oregon Trail crossed the South Platte River. Let me get you across the South Platte. That's the South Platte there. The surviving relay station has been moved to the town square at Gothenburg, Nebraska. Now just pause briefly. You see that man going up that pole? That's going to be the demise of the Pony Express. And there's the old stagecoach going in the river in the background. And the surviving relay station has been moved to the town square at Gothenburg, Nebraska. It was about 15 miles out on the plains. The Pony Express continued west, touched the northeast corner of Colorado, and joined the Oregon Trail a short distance before Chimney Rock in extreme western Nebraska. The route then followed the Oregon Trail past Scottsbluff and all the way to Fort Bridger in southwestern Wyoming. Through this, by Scottsbluff, and on over. One of the early stops in Wyoming was Fort Laramie, and we talked about that. It was in Wyoming on the run between Red Buttes and 3 crossings. It's a 76-mile run. Few antelopes. And in that run, William F. Buffalo Bill Cody was the usual rider. He had ridden other sections, but that was the usual one. He became the best known of the riders, but Pony Bob, Robert Haslam, J.H. Keatler, and dozens of others really should be mentioned. And then the rider was at South Pass, Wyoming, and shortly thereafter, the left fork of the parting of the ways. This is Buffalo Bill here, and this is out at South Pass. And the marker post where my wife was out in the, on the plains, it had said Oregon Trail on one side, and as you can see now, it says Pony Express on the other. Now from Fort Bridger, the route followed the Mormon Trail to Salt Lake Valley. It passed south of the Great Salt Lake. Let me catch it up here. That's old Fort Bridger. And then it passed just south of that. That, incidentally, is Antelope Island out in Great Salt Lake. Then it continued across the Utah and Nevada deserts and into Sacramento, as you can see by the map, across this type of countryside. On the route that the Overland stage had been using for over a year. And this is a model of the Sacramento Pony Express monument. The Pony Express lasted only about 18 months, with only 1 mail being lost in that time. The death knell was tolled by the whispering wire, the telegraph, in October of 1861. The last run was completed on October 24th, 1861. The financial sheet was not too good. $700,000 startup and 18 months operation. $500,000 receipts, given a loss of $200,000 for the net loss, even back in those days. But the Pony Express and its horses and riders has written into history one of the great thrilling experiences in the great tradition of the American West.